Hello, I'm John Hesse, Cahoga Presbyterian Church. I would like to read a story from Wise Words by Peter Lythart, and the story is The Labors of Braxton Hicks. Once there was a young man named Braxton Hicks. Now, I know as well as anyone that characters in fairy tales are not supposed to have last names. Just this once, it is important. If you don't believe me, go ask your mother. Anyway, Braxton Hicks was not your typical hero. He never went on any adventures. His mother never tried to lose him in the forest, although the thought did cross her mind from time to time. And the few dwarves in his town did not know any card tricks, much less magic spells. Braxton liked to stay home. He rarely left his room, to be perfectly honest. He rarely got out of bed. Of course, Braxton kept very busy. He had a lot to do and a lot to worry about. He had to go to the kitchen 3 to 8 times a day to find food. Some days, there was very little in the cupboard for the first few times, so he'd have to go 10 or 13 times. Sometimes he had to yell at his old mother before she'd fix enough food for him. Yelling at your mother's extremely hard work. And Braxton had to turn over in bed every now and then, which was not as easy for Braxton Hicks as it is for you and me. Besides that, Braxton Hicks had a special gift. He was able to see things ordinary people did not see, and to understand things ordinary people did not understand. Because he had so much to think about, he could think about everything in the world. He was full of ideas of how to make the world a better place. He felt deep within he must be a child of the gods. He was quite certain he had been given special wisdom to set the world right. Now you might be wondering how Braxton Hicks could set the world right if he never left his bed. How could he share his special wisdom if he never talked with anyone? Braxton himself wondered about that very same thing. He lay in his bed worrying and wondering for years and years, but he couldn't think of an answer. One day, Braxton's old mother died. At first, Braxton was sad, but after a few days, he concluded it was for the best. Now that I no longer have to care for my mother, he thought, I will be able to go out into the world. I will finally have the chance to set the world right by sharing my special wisdom with everyone I meet. The very next day, Braxton put the last few scraps of food into a pack and set off. He'd gone only a short way when he saw a man weeding a garden. The man looked very tired and sweat was streaming down his brow. "Good morning," Braxton shouted. The man looked up, said nothing. Braxton watched him for a moment, then said as politely as he could, "Excuse me, you're doing that all wrong. There's a much better way to do that." The man glared at him. "You know how to weed a garden, do you?" Braxton smiled. "I've always wanted a garden of my own. Will you let me work for a while?" The gardener thought for a moment, looked back and forth, shrugged his shoulders and said, "Well, I suppose you could work while I get something to drink. But listen, you need to pull these thistles here. There's been a boar crashing through the fence and trampling the turnips. If you see him coming, try to catch him, or at least stop him." Braxton nodded eagerly. "I will take care of things. Do not worry about your garden. I will guard it with my life." The man stood stiffly and walked off slowly toward the town's tavern. He called over his shoulder, "Don't tell anyone I let you do this. The owner of the garden's on a long journey, and I do not want to let him know I'm taking time off." Braxton Hicks knelt down along the first row of turnips. He cut his finger on the spiny stem of the first weed. After carefully pulling up 3 or 4 weeds, Braxton realized it was getting very hot. Then he felt sweat dripping down his back. Time for a short rest, he thought. Finding a shady spot under a tree, Braxton lay down and fell asleep. He slept only a moment, or so it seemed, before he was awakened by a terrible noise. A boar had crashed through the fence, splintering wood in every direction. Most of the vegetables were already crushed or eaten, and the carefully plowed garden had been churned into a muddy mess. At the far end of the garden, Braxton saw the grunting boar rooting for the last few turnips. Remembering the gardener's instructions, Braxton crept up behind the boar, leapt on its back, and grabbed its ears. This is not the best way to introduce oneself to a raging boar. The startled animal squealed and bolted through the hole in the fence, dragging a surprised Braxton Hicks along behind. The boar ran through a field and down the main street of town, squealing as he went. As they neared the town tavern, the gardener was coming out after having a few too many beers. He stared and rubbed his eyes. "What have you done to my garden?" he bellowed. Barely able to breathe, Braxton shouted back, "Don't worry, I'll come back and fix everything." "Oh, no, you will not," Braxton heard the gardener say as the boar dragged him out the other end of town. "If you try to come back to my garden, I'll kill you. I will kill you." It was late afternoon before Braxton Hicks finally had the idea of letting go of that boar's ears. By then, the boar dragged him far to the east of town. There was only one small house in sight, high up on a hill. With shaking legs, Braxton climbed the hill and knocked at the door. A young man answered. He was Braxton's own age and size. In fact, he looked so much like Braxton they could have been brothers. "Please, can you give me some food and water?" Braxton hissed through his dry lips. "I'm far from home and have no way back." "I do not give to beggars," the young man said as he began to close the door. "I am no beggar. How could you think such a thing? My, do I look like a beggar? No matter. I will work in your fields if you wish. Anything you ask. Just give me some food and water, please." The young farmer thought a moment, then opened the door. "All right. Tomorrow I have some harvesting to do, and I could use some more hands." The next morning, he took Braxton to the fields and showed him the tall hay he was to cut and bundle. "I have thought a lot about farming," Braxton said cheerfully as he swung the scythe this way and that. "I'm sure there's a better way to cut hay. When I am finished, farming will never again be the same." After watching Braxton for a few minutes, the young man left to work in another part of the field. Braxton had swung the scythe a few more times before he realized how hot it was. His hands were beginning to blister. A few swings later, he felt sweat trickling down his back. Time for a short rest, he thought. There were no trees, so Braxton lay down in the middle of the hay and fell asleep. As he slept, Braxton dreamed he was using his scythe to fight a 9-headed monster. Every time he cut off a head, 2 new ones grew back in its place. He swung furiously, back and forth, but he could not kill the monster. Braxton opened his eyes to see a face peering at him. His mind still full of his strange dream, Braxton rose up in the field and struck at the face with his scythe, nearly cutting off the head of the young farmer who could have been his brother. "What are you doing?" the young man cried, pointing at the spots of blood on the ground. "You hit me in the cheek with that thing. You nearly killed me." "I thought you were a 9-headed monster," Braxton answered lamely. "Why aren't you working?" the young man asked. When Braxton did not answer, the farmer said, "I think I made a mistake. You had better leave, and don't ever come back." Tired and hungry, Braxton returned to the highway and wandered off toward the east. When he reached the top of the next hill, he saw the sea stretch up before him like glass. Huddled against the shore was a small village. A ship was anchored in the shallow waters, its mast as tall as an oak. "I've always wanted to be a sailor," Braxton thought to himself. "I'm sure I'd be a very good sailor. And if I travel from place to place, I'll be able to share my special wisdom with everyone. I will truly be able to set the world right. No one in my own land appreciates my great wisdom anyway. All great geniuses are misunderstood. It is time to take my wisdom to the wider world." Braxton Hicks found the ship's captain and asked for work. Several sailors were ill, so the captain readily agreed to hire him. "What is your cargo?" Braxton asked. "Golden apples," the captain replied, "and when we get to the next port, we'll pick up ivory, baboons, and other animals." The next morning, the ship drew up its anchor and set off. At first, Braxton felt ship as the ship rolled back and forth, but he soon got used to it. When they'd been sailing for 3 hours, he reported to the captain. "What would you like me to do, sir?" "Go below into the cargo hold. You will find crates full of golden apples. Make sure that none are broken and none of the apples are damaged. Stack the crates, count them, and report back to me." Below deck, Braxton picked up a crate and got a splinter in his finger. He picked up another and realized how hot and stuffy it was in the hold of the ship. When he picked up the third, he felt a river of sweat flowing down his back. Time for a short rest, he thought, and he lay down on top of the crates of apples and fell into a deep sleep. While Braxton Hicks was sleeping, dark clouds formed in the sky. Thunder boomed and lightning crackled through the salty air. Rain came as if the windows of heavens were opened. The sea tossed and churned as if the fountains of the deep were broken up. Still, Braxton Hicks slept on. When lightning struck the mainmast, it split the deck with the force of its fall. The sailors and even the captain scrambled into lifeboats and desperately rowed away from the doomed ship, and still Braxton Hicks slept. I would like to tell you that Braxton Hicks awoke, rebuked the wind and the waves, and was saved. I would like to tell you that a great fish swallowed Braxton Hicks and carried him to safety. I would like to tell you that he was marooned on a desert island and taught the natives the ways of civilized man. But things like that are too strange for fairy tales. They only happen in real life. In fact, Braxton Hicks never woke up. He slept as the water filled the hold of the ship. He slept as the ship sank, and as the thunder crashed outside, he lay peacefully snoring on top of the crates of golden apples, and I suppose he's still sleeping there to this day. And the moral is from Proverbs 26, verses 14 through 16. As the door turns on its hinges, so does the sluggard on his bed. The sluggard buries his hand in its dish. He is weary of bringing it to his mouth again. The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can give a discreet answer. And thank you very much for your time.